This is the WJW podcast, brought to you by the Washington Jewish Week and Mid-Atlantic Media. Welcome to the WJW podcast. I'm your host, Aaron Trudler. I'm joined today by Amy Spitalnick. Amy is the CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, the national convener of Jewish coalitions working across different communities to build a just and inclusive American democracy. Previously, Amy served as the executive director of Integrity First for America. Amy has extensive experience in government, politics, and advocacy, including roles working for the New York State Attorney General, the mayor of the city of New York, and the New York State Senate. Amy Spitalnick, thank you for taking the time to chat.
Thanks so much for having me.
We've seen some very heated rhetoric in the American political arena, particularly in the context of the presidential race. I'm going to touch on the presidential race a little more shortly, but can you talk generally about some of the work that you and JCPA are doing relative to the political rancor that has become so pervasive in our nation's politics?
Absolutely. Look, we're living at a time of such polarization and such division. And ultimately, what this division does is it erodes the democratic norms and values that we know are inherent to all of our safety, including our safety as Jews. And so as our communities become more polarized, as our politics become more polarized, we're seeing concurrent increases in political violence and normalized conspiracy theories and hate and dehumanizing policies and rhetoric, and so much more. And so our work at JCPA is really rooted in the understanding that we as Jews have inherently been safest in inclusive, pluralistic democracies where we have strong ties between communities, or even across lines of deep disagreement on policies. We can still find ways to come together and say that we need to protect each other's safety, each other's rights, and our democracy. And at this moment, that's never been more urgent.
You talked about the polarization that we're experiencing, and the idea of bringing people together in the context of a coalition might seem to some to be somewhat foreign in light of the current events and the rhetoric that we're hearing on a daily basis. Can you give a couple examples, or talk in general terms perhaps even, about some of your efforts to build these coalitions, and what sort of a response are you getting when you're doing outreach and you're trying to enlist more people and organizations in your efforts?
Absolutely. So in fact, JCPA just launched this spring 2 brand new national coalitions, which we're calling action networks, rooted in protecting and advancing our democracy and countering anti-Semitism and all forms of hate. So on the democracy front, this includes everything from countering disinformation and extremism, ensuring election integrity and voter engagement and access, voting rights and civil rights, and grappling with the slew of challenges we've seen in all different directions on the book ban and curriculum front, whether in red states, book bans that have gone after issues like slavery or LGBTQ rights, or in some cases Holocaust education, as has been extensively reported, or in other states where we've seen ethnic studies curriculums, which are important, but also have been utilized in certain localities to advance anti-Israel or anti-Semitic ideas. And it requires direct work by the local Jewish community to really navigate and move those forward in a way that's inclusive. On the countering hate and broader bigotry front, that certainly includes our work on anti-Semitism, and I would say specifically in better telling the story of how anti-Semitism is inextricably linked with so many other forms of hate. Because anti-Semitism uniquely operates as a conspiracy theory, it's harder to understand for some how it fuels and animates broader forms of hate, whether it's racism, white supremacy, misogyny, anti-immigrant hate, anti-LGBTQ hate, or so much more. But as we've seen these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories become normalized in our society, we know that anti-Semitism is so directly linked to these other forms of hate. The same conspiracy theories espoused by the Pittsburgh shooter in 2018 have fueled a cycle of violence from Charlottesville to El Paso to Buffalo to Jacksonville, Florida, targeting the Black community, the Latino community, Muslims, immigrants, and so many others. And so how we not only mobilize for all communities' rights and safety and to counter hate and dehumanization, but also help better tell that story of why the fight for Jewish safety must be inextricably linked with the fight for democracy and for all communities. And that's something that particularly, I would say, in a post-October 7th world is even more urgent.
Okay, I want to touch on some of the points you made about anti-Semitism, but before we do that, let me just pivot back to the presidential race. So obviously the news, President Biden's stunning and historic news that he had decided to drop out of the race sent shockwaves across the nation. You reacted to the news by saying, quote, "Joe Biden has been an extraordinary president and an extraordinary public servant. We owe him a massive debt of gratitude for all he's given to this country." He's had a long and distinguished career in public service, and obviously this upends the race in a way that perhaps some may have anticipated, but frankly, I think a lot of this is really uncharted territory in many ways. On the flip side, you've been critical of former President Donald Trump at various points for different statements that he's made over the years. How do you see the presidential race playing out, and how critical do you feel that this particular election is in terms of determining not just the future of our country, but the future of American democracy?
I'll say first and foremost, we're a 501c3, so we are very careful not to engage in electoral politics. That being said, it can't be considered partisan to talk about the actual policies being put forward by an administration or a candidate. And particularly when at this moment we're seeing the increasing normalization of anti-Semitic or otherwise bigoted ideas in our politics, not just on the presidential level, but on all levels of politics and government. These conspiracy theories rooted in anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and other forms of hate. And so we need to be able to have those conversations to call out that increasingly normalized hate and bigotry, to disagree on policies, but not let it turn into actual dehumanization and other dangerous rhetoric that we know has directly fueled violence in a variety of ways. Okay, the Biden administration has put forward a historic strategy to counter anti-Semitism. There's nothing like that we've seen until this strategy that came out in May of 2023 was released, that really sort of puts a direct spotlight not on just the urgency of countering anti-Semitism, but the comprehensive whole of government and whole of society approach necessary to do so, and makes the case that countering anti-Semitism, that protecting the Jewish community is inherent to our democracy and inherent to protecting all communities. And in doing so, we must not simply, fight anti-Semitism, but also build the cross-community solidarity necessary to bring all communities along in the fight. And that's at the core of what we do at JCPA. So suffice it to say, we were really proud to be deeply engaged in that strategy and are supportive of everything that can be done to move it forward. And it's important that no matter how the election goes this fall, that whole of government, whole of society approach to countering anti-Semitism, to understanding Jewish safety's deep connections to inclusive, pluralistic democracy are not lost. And at the same time, I think it's so crucial that we be able to have these frank conversations about how everyone from former President Trump to other elected officials and candidates have used rhetoric, have used language that we've seen directly fuel a cycle of violence, including some of this invasion and replacement rhetoric that directly underpinned the shootings in Pittsburgh, Poway, El Paso, Buffalo, and other places, including the claims that Jews are disloyal if we don't vote Republican or don't support President Trump, which we've seen over and over again. And again, in a post-October 7th world, when we know that there are extreme voices in all directions trying to pit the Jewish community against others, to divide our pro-democracy, anti-hate coalitions, it's so much more important that we call out this increasingly normalized hate in all of its forms, wherever it manifests, including if it comes from candidates, from elected officials, from progressive leaders or organizations, on college campuses, on social media, or wherever it may exist.
Keeping on that same topic to a certain extent, when you were at Integrity First for America, you brought a groundbreaking lawsuit against the neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and hate groups that were responsible for the violence in Charlottesville in 2017. Can you talk a little bit about that situation and how you essentially became a leading voice against white supremacy and extremism.
You know, I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, and that was such a formative part of my identity growing up. It still is. But if you had told me then that we would need to sue neo-Nazis in the year 2021 to hold them accountable for anti-Semitic racist violence, I probably would have thought you were crazy, because my grandparents came here knowing that it was a place where they could make a better life for their family. And that was true for such a big portion of my life. I grew up at a time in America where Jews really were safe, where so many communities largely felt safe. Not everyone, but certainly at least the Jewish community felt free and safe from the anti-Semitism that had shaped so much of my grandparents' lives. And so in the last decade, we've really seen that Band-Aid ripped off. And I think Charlottesville, for me, was one of the most formative moments in that path. Neo-Nazis so emboldened, so empowered that they could march, chanting things like "Jews will not replace us" and "blood and soil" on an American city, terrorizing students because of who they are and what they believe, including targeting Black and Latino and other students surrounding the synagogue in downtown Charlottesville, and otherwise espousing just vile, bigoted hate and ultimately violence that led to the death of Heather Heyer and extensive injuries. And so when the opportunity to partner with the incredible legal team involved with that lawsuit and the brave plaintiffs, 9 Charlottesville residents who were injured in that violence, including many in the car attack, when that opportunity came up, I had been working in the New York Attorney General's office and had been very closely following the aftermath of Charlottesville, of course. It was impossible to say no. There's nothing more important than making clear that sort of hate and violence has no place here. And only by holding extremists accountable are we going to begin to actually change the tide of what's become increasingly normalized. And we know that what happened in Charlottesville wasn't an isolated incident. It really was a preview of the extremism and hate that's followed. The cycle of white supremacist violence that we've talked about, including the deadliest attack on the Jewish community in American history in Pittsburgh, the Poway attack, El Paso, Buffalo, and so many others, as we've been talking about, but also increasingly normalized anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and tropes that we're hearing in a variety of different ways, including from elected officials and politicians, including on certain college campuses, including in a variety of other spaces, where all of a sudden it feels like it's coming at us from all directions. And so the only way forward is one in which we are drawing clear lines that make clear, that underscore what's extremism and hate and what's not, helping folks understand where that line is, holding extremists and other bigots to account for engaging in this hate, and making very, very clear that we need to overcome lines of difference in order to be united against this increasingly pervasive extremism and violence.
You talked a little bit about before about President Biden's national strategy to counter anti-Semitism. We just talked about Charlottesville, and you've mentioned, you rattled off a whole bunch of other unfortunate incidents where anti-Semitism was front and center and really resulted in serious and grave harm to people and places. I feel like we're in a place now where anti-Semitism is rising seemingly exponentially on a global scale. And as you've touched on, it's becoming more pervasive. It's becoming more mainstream. And I think you just talked about, you alluded to the fact that education, letting people know about the different lines and what could be crossed, what shouldn't be crossed, is key to overcoming this real crisis, I think, that has taken the world by storm. As you work at JCPA and you work with other organizations, other community leaders, different communities, Jewish and non-Jewish, how do you tackle that issue? You talked about the new initiative that you formed at JCPA, but practically speaking, how can we collaborate and really work together to not only curb anti-Semitism, but to try and educate people in a more in-depth way as to the dangers of anti-Semitism and, quite frankly, all bigotry. It's Jews and non-Jews. We're in this together. How can we do that?
Well, so I was really fortunate to spend some time working with a great group of Jewish and democracy-focused foundations over the last year to explore this very question, right? How can we actually better help diverse communities understand their stake in the fight against anti-Semitism, and particularly better connect the conversations on anti-Semitism and our inclusive pluralistic democracy. So we just released a report that's available on the JCPA website that specifically looks at this question: how anti-Semitism and inclusive democracy are inextricably linked for so many reasons. One, because we know anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and hate tend to fuel and animate broader hate and extremism in so many ways. And because as democracy erodes, as our democratic norms and values and the rule of law erode, we know that that tends to create the conditions in which anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories further flourish. And so it's this two-way street in which the only way in which Jews will be safe is if we are working towards an inclusive, pluralistic democracy in which all people are safe. And the only way in which all communities will be safe and will have a strong democracy is if Jews are safe and we effectively confront anti-Semitism. And so often we're not telling that story or approaching the fight against anti-Semitism through that lens. We tend to look at hate as sort of these silos, as these individual particularist challenges. But at the end of the day, they're inextricably linked. And to effectively engage communities, including younger Americans and so many that we're often wringing our hands about engaging in this fight, we need to better tell that story. We need to help them understand their own stake in the fight, not only because it's accurate, it's correct. We see firsthand how anti-Semitism and anti-democratic extremism are linked, not only because it's the right thing to do, that we as Jews are taught values of justice, that democracy is so at the core of our own values and our own history, but also because the research tells us it's actually the most effective message to engaging the people we need to engage in this fight, younger Americans and others who are not necessarily understanding or aware of the unique way anti-Semitism operates or how it might manifest in a variety of different ways, including in the Israel conversation. And so that requires certainly calling it out where possible, but also leaning into these hard conversations wherever we can. I had an opportunity last month to engage with Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in a fairly unprecedented webinar on anti-Semitism, not because she and I agree on every policy, certainly as it relates to Israel or otherwise, but because she is eager to think about how to engage in the fight against anti-Semitism and the fight for democracy, and sees the link between these issues and wanted to have a frank conversation for her community. And I was really grateful to her for this, despite the disagreements we might have on specific policies, inviting me and my colleague Stacey Burdett to have this conversation, to recognize we have disagreements, but also, as she did during that webinar, to acknowledge that anti-Semitism really can manifest in a variety of forms, including in the Israel conversation, and that it's a threat to progressives, to progressive values, to our progressive communities, and to the very peace that many might be believing they're fighting for when they show up at some of these protests or other events that have veered into anti-Semitism in a number of cases. And so being able to lean into those hard conversations to say we're going to overcome lines of disagreement, to find the ways we can work together to call out anti-Semitism and all forms of hate and extremism right now, because all of our safety is wrapped up in one another's, is just so crucial. And if we can't do that, we are never going to be able to actually advance the policies and the solutions we need.
Amy, you talked about the hard conversations that people need to have. I found this to be a very important conversation, and I just wanted to thank you so much for taking the time to chat.
No, thank you so much for having me. Really grateful to you for putting a spotlight on JCPA's work and for all you're doing right now at what's not an easy moment for our community.
Thank you so much.